Hey, and welcome back to the committee program. Our next segment is a thing we call Deep Dive, where we do a dive, but make it deep. So talk a little bit more about something than you normally hear about. And to introduce our first topic on our first deep dive is our own Julia Doubleday.
Thank you, Arun. I have with us today Andre Pagliarini. He is a lecturer of history and Latin American studies at Dartmouth University. He's also working on a manuscript for a book about nationalism in Brazil. And he's going to help us understand the current situation in Brazil, from President Bolsonaro's botched COVID-19 response to the return of former President Lula da Silva as a presidential challenger in next year's election. We're also going to be discussing the recent upheaval in President Bolsonaro's cabinet after he replaced many of his ministers amidst concern about his growing authoritarianism. So thank you so much, Andre, for being with us here today.
Thank you for the invitation. It's a real pleasure to be here talking with you guys.
Awesome. So first we want to delve into this cabinet overhaul. So can you tell us a little bit about, who left, who resigned, what was kind of the impetus for this slew of resignations, and why is it making a lot of people nervous about President Bolsonaro?
Yeah, so the situation in Brazil has gotten to a point where a few weeks ago, basically in very simple terms, something had to give. I think the Bolsonaro government, those close to him, sensed that he needed to make some kind of shift to suggest that he was listening to critics and allies who said, look, you got to do something differently here. The Speaker of the House, of the lower chamber of Congress, gave a speech where he basically said, in kind of oblique terms, that there are remedies Congress could take. Some of them are painful, some of them are lethal, which many interpreted as a reference to impeachment, if Bolsonaro did not do something to suggest that he gets it, he understands. So maybe the most prominent thing he did was fire his foreign minister, who was widely blamed for the disastrous situation in Brazil regarding COVID, because Brazil is importing, to the extent that there are vaccines in Brazil and there are shortages, Brazil still depends on shipments from abroad. So it did not seem like the foreign minister at the time, this guy named Ernesto Araújo, was putting the most diplomatic efforts, the best efforts forward to acquire the necessary materials. In fact, quite the opposite. This is a guy who, over the course of his tenure, and he had been there since the beginning, so 2019, has picked fights with those he deems responsible for what he called the globalist agenda. He's questioned the provenance of the coronavirus, the China virus, and using that kind of language and globalism. And so this is a guy who really alienated a lot of people that Brazil, when the coronavirus and the pandemic struck, needed help, needed international collaboration. And this is a guy who did a lot to really, I think, create a negative perception of Brazil around the world. So he's gone. He was fired. Replaced with someone who was deemed to be much more of not quite a technocrat, but a much more sort of sober diplomat, someone who had been in the ceremonial office of Brazil's foreign service, someone who could try to reset Brazil's relationships with these really important countries. So that was maybe the most prominent one.
I mean, it seems like, Brazil has been, and the regime has managed to get both the initial response and the vaccination response wrong, while usually you get to do one or the other. Here in Germany, we can test and trace the hell out of anything. We don't necessarily vaccinate that great. America, couldn't test for crap, but can vaccinate just vast swaths of humans quickly. What's going on?
Yeah, and it gets to this point about the pandemic and Bolsonaro's handling of it, which is, I think, raised international concern, consternation, but also curiosity around the world. It's like, what explains this really terrible response to the pandemic? I think it comes down to a few things. One of them is really, and it almost sounds, silly, but I think there is this kind of deep unwillingness on Bolsonaro's part to grapple with the vulnerability that everyone around the world feels with the pandemic, right? He has basically said, almost verbatim, that the country needs to kind of suck it up and get through it and get back to work. He said literally today that the country cannot stop. He called governors who are instituting lockdowns in their states, pseudo-governors. He said, who are trying to implement little dictatorships in their own states. So I think it's this sense of kind of macho, unwillingness to recognize vulnerability, combined with this idea that, the major promise of the Bolsonaro candidacy when he was running in 2018 was, never mind the rhetoric of, anti-minority and misogynistic and racist. His main thing was going to be this liberalizing of economic reforms, to lower the size of the state, economic reforms. And so, in other words, the economy can't stop. Because if the economy goes, the whole kind of bargain that he made, I think, with the electorate goes with it. And so those two together have been this really kind of cocktail of denialism, if you will, that has put Brazil, in this horrible, horrible predicament.
I think that...
And so
Oh, go ahead.
Well, just to go back to what, it's related to this, the cabinet shakeup from a few weeks ago, there was some real sense there, and we still haven't really gotten the full story, that the military is potentially trying to sort of extricate itself from this administration, because they bet heavily on Bolsonaro in 2018, and there's at this point more military figures across the government in roles of authority across the administration than there have been since the military regime ended in the 1980s. And so he fired his Minister of Defense, and the three heads of the branches resigned or were fired in protest. Again, we don't really know the full story, but it suggests, and I've argued this at the time, that Bolsonaro is sort of steeling himself for something. I mean, it seems like there are moves being made by him and those close to him to looking ahead to the re-election next year to potentially, and it's very preliminary at this point, but to potentially, if he doesn't win, right, to question the results.
This is sounding very familiar.
It looks like he wants exactly. It looks like he wants to have people he can count on in these key positions,
right,
should it come to that.
Yeah, it's interesting what how you were speaking about those initial resignations, because my understanding was really that Bolsonaro was potentially isolating himself even more, from the world and from the political establishment. It sounds like the firing of this diplomat, who I know you've referred to as the world's worst diplomat, it sounds like that actually was maybe a move to bring himself more back into the fold of the establishment. But my understanding is that when the heads of the military were stepping down, there basically was a public perception of a feud between them and Bolsonaro, and that there was this sort of shot at him about how the army is always going to be independent from politics. Like, they were speaking about sort of like this veiled shot at him that, we're not going to just do whatever an administration tells us to do. We are independent. This isn't a military state. Right. So it's interesting that it sounds like maybe he's sort of scrambling and just throwing everything at the wall, and all of that may come back to Lula re-entering the fold.
Yeah, well, one thing I would say that is telling, though, about the cabinet ministers that he did fire and those he retained is, I think we can think of it as, there's an expression in Portuguese, maybe in English too, where he's cutting the finger to save the hand. Mm-hmm. So he fired the foreign minister, who by all accounts was, he felt very attached to. It was a guy who really, they were in sync in terms of the kind of conspiratorial worldview and all that. But he fired him. Another minister, though, who, there are widespread demands that he be fired as well, is the Minister of the Environment, this guy named Ricardo Salles, who, in my view, the fact that this guy is still in the cabinet suggests a sort of fundamental unseriousness about reining in deforestation and all of that, because Salles, again, almost in his own words, sees the economic development of the Amazon as a priority, meaning,
cutting
economic opportunities, deforestation, mining, all of that stuff, right? And so I think what we saw was it got to a point with the foreign minister, Araújo, that really senators were, there was no more room to deny and to kind of shift and to move around. So I think Bolsonaro made the tactical decision to, let him go. But meanwhile, keeping this other guy who's equally as dangerous, equally as damaging, I think, to Brazil's long-term, standing in the world in place. And so basically, just to wrap up this point, there are multiple narratives, I think, emerging about Brazil's political situation right now. One of them is that the military is sort of getting tired of its association with this administration because it's starting to make the institution of the armed forces look bad. And so they're trying to kind of step back. On the other hand, people say, sort of not so fast, right? That the military sanctioning Bolsonaro in 2018 gave him a lot of credibility. It helped him, no doubt, electorally. And they're still occupying these positions across the federal government. They don't get to sort of now say, well, we had nothing to do with this. This is not our problem. That the military is already deeply, deeply tarnished, and that damage is going to take a while to be undone. So,
are these the swing voters, though? Like, are these the equivalent of Trump's suburban, whatever people who thought it was okay to go with Bolsonaro because the army says it's okay, and in the past they've sort of been in a parochial way, kind of are betters and have taken care of things. Is he losing some of those people? Who is he keeping and who is he losing in the face of this incompetence and other sort of evil doing, for lack of a better term?
That's a great question because, I think historians are going to be debating for years and years to come how this guy, who he didn't really come out of nowhere. He had been a congressman for for decades, but he really, Brazil, even more so than the United States, to be a serious contender for the presidency, you need to have a major party. Usually, this is traditionally how it's been since democracy returned in the 80s. Major party, because being part of a major party gives you television time. There are these allotted campaign slots during the campaign. And if you're the size of your representation in Congress dictates the amount of time you get on TV. So the thing is to be a part of a major party and you negotiate with smaller parties to put together all this television time. Bolsonaro upends that completely. He's from a very small party. He doesn't rely on television advertising. He's much stronger on social media. In fact, in a way, revolutionary, because never before in the history of Brazil had someone come from sort of out of nowhere politically to win. And I think to your question, there's a few ways that he signals credibility, aside from sort of young male supporters who call him, mito, the myth, like he's this mythical figure on the social media. So that was captive early on. But then how do you signal, if you're Bolsonaro, how do you signal a broader kind of credibility? Part of that, I would say, two major points. One that you raise is the military, which is this. Even progressives and those on the center left and left will say that one of the major shortcomings of the Workers' Party years in power, center-left Workers' Party is in power from 2003 to 2016, is that they failed to adequately handle the question of public security. That there are, all kinds of really important social programs that they implemented, all this other stuff. But, people in poor communities, for example, you feel unsafe in a lot of cases. And so this was a person, Bolsonaro, who was able to capitalize on that. Like, look, nothing's worked. The only way to deal with these, bad guys and crooks is to put a bullet in their heads. This is why I think the comparison with Duterte in the Philippines is often made. Because it's this idea of like, there's nothing else works. We just have to kill these bad guys. And the military, I think, they don't endorse Bolsonaro openly, but, his vice president is a general. It's no secret who the military, wants to win. And I think that signals that, look, this isn't just some crazy guy. It's a guy who has an in with the armed forces. They're going to help, logistically come up with the plans and all this. So it signals, I think, a kind of, notion that this isn't just a crazy zealot, Bolsonaro, that he actually does have an in with the armed forces. And so people who might gravitate towards this issue of public security, that really is a problem. Maybe it is good to have a candidate there with, really deep links to the armed forces, as opposed to, just as a, counterexample, former President Dilma Rousseff, who had taken up arms against the military regime in the past, and who, there was always tension between her and the armed forces. So that's one thing. The other major gesture I think he made to signal credibility was by naming his finance minister early on, this guy named Paulo Guedes, who is literally a Chicago boy, he founded a major bank in Brazil, And so Bolsonaro had never, economic policy during his time in Congress had never been his forte. He's, frankly, not that interested in matters of, macroeconomics, things like that. But this guy, Paulo Guedes, said, matters of economy, talk to Paulo Guedes. And his whole thing, right, is reducing the size of the state, privatizing state industries. He implemented a pension reform system that critics say really hurts poor and working class people. But, I know this anecdotally, but also in the reporting, that a lot of people who preferred a sort of more moderate center-right candidacy in 2018, they said, well, Bolsonaro might be crazy, but Paulo Guedes, this guy, he's a serious, economic guy. Maybe we do need someone like that to institute the reforms that Brazil has long needed under, the leftist parties like, the PT and arguably they would say before that, these liberalizing reforms never happened. Maybe now is our chance. So they held their nose and voted for Bolsonaro. So those two, I think, are the major steps that he took to signal credibility. And the major storyline for next year, as he goes into re-election, is to what extent he can continue to placate these two different constituencies.
I mean, I know that we're certainly not the first to compare Bolsonaro to Trump in the U.S., but it sounds like from what you're talking about, we're going to see this like very similar response to him as he's running for re-election. The same sort of response we got to Trump, which is that the COVID response was so botched and he became so isolated that even people who sort of said, okay, well, I don't think Trump totally represents how I feel about the Republican Party, but he's wildly popular and I may not like every crazy thing he says, but I'm going to vote for him. It seems like a lot of those people actually did come over and either vote for Joe Biden or sit it out. Not to understate the popularity that Trump still had. And I think that you've also spoken to Bolsonaro still has this sort of floor of support. He's still going to get 30% of the vote no matter what. So I guess, I'm wondering to what degree that relationship between Trump and Bolsonaro may also led to him becoming more isolated on the world stage after Trump lost. Because, one thing I noticed is it seems like they sort of just put all their eggs in the Trump basket, the Bolsonaro administration. It's like whenever they had to choose between Trump's doing one thing, the international community disagrees, they're very much just sort of staying on America's side. And now with Biden in office, I'm curious to what degree that's sort of led to this further isolation of the administration.
Yeah, and there's a very clear issue in which this dynamic is playing out, which is, the climate summit that was just, before last weekend, I think Thursday and Friday, I believe. This idea of should the Biden administration negotiate with Bolsonaro directly regarding conservation efforts? Now, there were a whole host of civil society organizations, activist groups, both in Brazil, but also in the United States, and really everywhere, saying, don't negotiate, don't give money to this administration, because Bolsonaro government, the environment minister I mentioned earlier, Ricardo Salles, basically said Brazil could cut deforestation by 40% in 1 year for $1 billion. Now,
give us the money.
Given the track record, given the track record of this administration, there's no real reason to think that all of a sudden they're going to, well, now we care. Now, because they've been denying that deforestation is an issue this whole time.
What do you think motivated?
What
do you think motivated this sudden sort of about face? Like aside from just maybe getting $1 billion check, like did this also sort of come from Lula re-entering the political scene?
I think that's part of it. I think it's a concession to the reality that things are changing. Right? It's not 2018 anymore. Mm-hmm. That Trump is gone, Lula is back, and that. Again, just like when he let the foreign minister go, as I mentioned earlier, it's a gesture. It's a way of saying, we get it, we hear you, and all of that. The question is, should you reward that opening that the Bolsonaro administration seems to be making? And by the way, already we know that it was just words because Bolsonaro's new budget, approved over the weekend, actually cuts investment in the enforcement of the Amazon, which he promised to actually double during his speech. So in other words, the people who said it was just going to be empty talk have sort of already been vindicated. Mm-hmm. But the fundamental debate is should you engage with this administration, or should activists and all that continue to isolate him on the world stage? Because at this point, the thinking goes, if you do negotiate with him, if you do give him a win, as it were, you might be strengthening his hand ahead of next year. So it might actually,
just enough juice to get him over the finish line, right?
Exactly.
Right. Well, I mean, even the fact that he's attempting a pivot, I would say, means that he understands much better than Trump did that he's actually in trouble. I think Trump, until the very end, was pretty confident that he was going to win, and also after he lost, he was still confident that he had won. So,
but you're right. I mean, thinking about this as we're talking, it reminds me a little bit of like when Trump would wear a mask and then. Because it sounded like he had just been told.
It kind of just changed every day. Yeah, he couldn't really commit to the pivot.
That's very much Bolsonaro, where he'll say one thing, and it sounds like he's pulling teeth to get to say no. The Amazon is in danger. We're gonna do all we can, and the next day he says, it's just a totally different line. And so in that sense, that does remind me of Trump.
It's like the rock star who has to smoke until they die because they wrote the song "Smoke Until I Die."
Because they're too deeply invested, right?
Just to be nakedly political about this, and I know a lot of folks listening will, have feelings about Lula as an exciting figure on the global progressive left. Bolsonaro, his team, they do the thing that Republicans do so well, the right wing do, which is accusing other people of doing whatever they're doing and making it stick effectively. So, if corruption is their thing, they very effectively use that as the brush that they have painted the PT with not just Lula, of course, Juma, everyone has their turn in the sun. To what extent does the reversal on Lula give him an extra boost of credibility coming into this election? And they lied about me, the bastards. And how much is it he still has this damage of corruption, and Bolsonaro gets to keep some of those people forever because they're just like, yeah, but those guys are crooks.
And let me piggyback on that as well and say let's get some context about Operation Car Wash and just give people a little bit of a rundown of what happened to Lula and what has more recently happened with those convictions being tossed out.
Yeah. So I'll just kind of link those two really quickly. So basically, Operation Car Wash is this long-running investigation, began officially in 2014, into these huge amounts of money being siphoned off from Brazil's state-owned oil company, Petrobras, which found basically that there was money being diverted at almost every level of government, almost every political party, nobody is getting away from these allegations, this investigation, sort of unscathed, at least. Institutionally, parties, not every individual, but, parties and things like that. Over the course of, a few years of the investigation, it becomes clear to many observers that while the corruption being revealed is systemic, the only party that seems to really be hurt and really, crippled by the allegations is the Workers' Party. Now, trying to be as sort of fair as possible about the allegations, one could say that's because the PT, the Workers' Party, was in charge, ran the federal government for 13 years. So it might make sense that they're most, sort of enmeshed in all of this. But what ends up happening is that Lula is the main, it's quickly apparent he's the main big fish that they're sort of after. Because, being able to implicate him in this corruption would really be a signal. This is the argument. This is the logic that things have changed in Brazil. That there is no more elite impunity. We've even bagged a former president. Like, this is a big deal. Long story short, Lula gets arrested on charges of money laundering for this duplex apartment, this small apartment in a beachside town in Santos in the state of São Paulo. The charges, this is what ultimately gets the charges undone, is that the crime is very loosely linked to Petrobras, to Operation Car Wash. And yet, Lula gets sentenced for corruption, for money laundering, that he supposedly received this apartment as sort of illicit payment for kickbacks and all of that. Now, what we now know is that the judge overseeing those cases was in cahoots with the prosecution, that he was literally sort of texting behind the defense's back, suggesting lines.
It's the good stuff. It's the real corruption, it's the pure.
And that's no. You raise a really interesting point, because I've had this conversation with anti-Lula friends and family, which is, is that not corruption? So I think Car Wash really instilled this idea in Brazilian political discourse that what corruption means is money being siphoned off from state institutions. That's it. That's corruption. Well, Bolsonaro is, attempted to change the head of the Brazilian federal police, the equivalent of the FBI, in the state of Rio. Why? Because his son is under indictment, under investigation. Is that not corruption? Right? So I think part of the damage that Operation Car Watch has done, and some would argue it's done a lot of good, but ultimately one of the bad things I think it's done is to define sort of malfeasance so narrowly that now there isn't really a vocabulary to talk about the misdeeds in a lot of ways of what Bolsonaro was doing and all these other parties as well.
Right. And I know... I was just going to say... my understanding as well is that, so when the judge was prosecuting this case, Lula was sent to jail. He had been the front runner in the presidential election. Bolsonaro ends up winning against the man that was sent in to replace Lula on the ticket. Mm-hmm. And then the judge was given a role in that administration. So there was this sort of obvious, immediate quid pro quo happening, which I think really started to get people upset about, the malfeasance that may have been going on.
I mean, even people who supported Operation Car Wash, who thought the judge in the case, Sergio Moro, was a hero, even a lot of them said, well, it does seem unseemly that this is the guy
right, even if you aren't corrupt, why would you even take this position, right?
It's the appearance, of corruption, that he goes on to join the administration of the man who was the most benefited by his decision to lock up Lula. So now, to Arun's question about how this is playing out right now.
Yeah, how sticky.
Many sort of anti-Lula people will say, well, he's not innocent. He hasn't been absolved. It's just that there was this technicality of the judge that, it's a technicality. Now, to that, one might say, well, no, he is innocent because one is innocent until proven guilty. And so the case was deemed tainted by a biased judge. And so, the Lula has to be given the same benefit of the doubt as anybody else. And you asked about the sort of the taint of corruption. Is he going to be marred by this? Polling indicates there's a few ways to read it. Lula leads in most instances in the first round, and leads or is really competitive with Bolsonaro in the second round in most polls. Either that means most people are willing to forgive and they don't care, about the charges, the clouds hanging over Lula, because they think back to his years in power. Whatever he was doing, it was better than this, right? He was more capable of conducting himself in a dignified manner with the other parties and all this stuff. So it's either that, or they believe that there was a conspiracy against Lula to knock him out of the running that has now been reversed, and rightfully so. So again, it might be too soon to know exactly which one of those is happening, but there's no doubt that the political ground in Brazil has shifted incredibly in just a few years. And it's a large part to do with these revelations that came out published by The Intercept in Brazil, who received thousands of hacked conversations between the judge and the prosecutors. Without that evidence, I think we would be in a very different place. So it suggests how fluid the situation is, how quickly things can change. Right now, Lula is back in the running. He seems to be vindicated. He seems really thrilled to be back in the race. I mean, he's going after Bolsonaro with gusto, and I do think Bolsonaro is scared. He's shaken by this, so it's forcing some of the adaptations we were talking about earlier from his part.
Yeah, and that leads really well into my next question, which is essentially just, what can we expect from this sort of showdown between these two titans of Brazilian politics? I mean, I assume that next year's election is likely going to be one of the most exciting, most watched elections globally. So what do you sort of foresee, not just in terms of who's likely to win, but in terms of how these two are going to approach the campaign? Especially in light of the COVID crisis?
There's an attempt right now among some in the center-right to portray Lula and Bolsonaro as mirror opposites of each other. That, Lula is just as far from the center as is Bolsonaro. Bolsonaro is a far right, Lula is far left. Judging from the polling, most people don't seem to buy that, right? That Lula is some kind of radical in the way that Bolsonaro, just his political style suggests that he's kind of out there on the margins. He alienates a lot of people. He's rude and crude and crass. Lula, I mean, he has this, decades of experience in the labor movement and then building a party and being president, where some fault him for this, but he knows how to schmooze. He knows how to build bridges. He knows how to bring people together. Already he's saying quite clearly, we need to talk to the center. We need to talk to center-right. We need to talk to people who might have voted for Bolsonaro last time. We need to talk to people who might have voted to impeach Dilma in 2016, if it means defeating Bolsonaro. So this is one of the things that is unique about Lula, that in 2018, his former Minister of Education, Fernando Haddad, ran in his stead, who just, nobody can match the kind of the magic that Lula has. And I say that without trying to kind of it's nothing mystical. It's just that he is one of the great political talents of world politics, I think, of the 20th century. And so if anybody can build a coalition large enough to take on Bolsonaro, and even broader than Bolsonaro, it's this sense of anti-PT anger. And the bet that I think Lula's candidacy will be making next year is that anti-PT sentiment, antipetismo as the Brazilian term, has dissipated, has cooled enough after the disaster of Bolsonaro's governance. Right now, he seems to be on pretty solid footing to make that bet, given the polls. Now, there is an attempt, as I mentioned, to kind of, no, these guys are basically the same. They're radicals. We need a third way. So,
Love the third way.
If the major fight right now is between Bolsonaro,
we never like the third way.
Right. So this is kind of like the second tier battle that's happening right now, is to decide who might that person be, and if they're able to narrow it to one. Because Brazil, there's dozens of parties, right?
Right.
Usually, since the return of democracy in the 80s, the runoff has been the PT and the PSDB, the sort of center-right party of former President Fernando Henrique. That changes with Bolsonaro, who is a kind of far right against the center-left. Now, among the center, right now, I mean, as we speak, these parties are negotiating to try to come to some kind of consensus that there would be just one name, because otherwise there's just too many, and they get maybe 5%, 4%, and they can't challenge these two behemoths. So these are two things to watch: is who is going to emerge from these negotiations on the lower level. These are smaller parties. They don't have as big names, but, they're not nobodies, right? The governor of the state of São Paulo, who supported Bolsonaro in 2018, but is now a vehement opponent, he wants to run for president. Ciro Gomes, who served in Lula's administration, he's definitely running. It's just a question of how many people can he get on his side. So that's one storyline to sort of watch. The other is sort of the main event is what happens with Bolsonaro, right? Is he going to continue this kind of slow motion implosion that seems to be happening? Maybe. And on the left, the Workers' Party. I mean, there are some people, if you look at Lula's candidacy, who say he actually might not end up running. That he might just be trying to hold on to as much political capital as he can until the last minute, and then pass it off.
That doesn't sound like any politician in the history of anywhere has ever done any time. But anyway, we can put our bets down.
They're not that humble.
No, because he spent 580 days in jail. He wants to be back in the presidential palace.
He looks hungry.
Right?
He looks hungry.
Yeah.
He looks mad. And that's the way we want him looking. I think that's okay.
No, and after his conviction was overturned and all this, Lula gave this wonderful speech, and I say that without like being a partisan, but just even critics said, "Man, that's what a president sounds like," right? Because he had this kind of righteous indignation about the way the pandemic is being handled in Brazil. He said, Brazil has no government right now. That this, what is this government doing? He talked about building bridges with the center, building bridges with people who disagree with you, talking about science. I mean, basically hitting everything that a president should be saying in a moment like this. That Bolsonaro, I mean, literally, it's almost comical. Lula in the speech said, Bolsonaro doesn't believe the earth is round. He's anti-science. That afternoon, Bolsonaro did a Facebook Live event, and he never before had this, but this time he had a globe on his desk to suggest that, I know
I know about that.
Yeah, exactly. And so it was just seen as this almost like pathetic,
he's watching all of Lula's Instagram stories, is what you're saying. Yeah.
Right. And he's shaken because, remember, in 2018, Bolsonaro avoided the debates in the second round. He cannot articulate.
That's familiar.
A vision, exactly. It sounds... Remember, there were rumors that Trump was going to try to do the same thing. And so one imagines he is terrified of facing Lula on a stage in the second round. And so we'll see.
We'll have to have you in when that's starting to come in, so you can tell us how things are going and what things are looking like when we have more.
Yeah, post-debate analysis, for sure.
Maybe a third storyline here just to watch is that there are some now movements, some speculation that Bolsonaro might not even make the runoff. I don't tend to think that because I think, as Julia said earlier, I think he does have a floor of support that are with him throughout all this. But especially Ciro Gomes, who I mentioned, is trying to get that coveted third way spot. He seems to be betting that the runoff will be between him and Lula, sort of center against center left. Again, I find that to be unlikely, but it's something to watch.
Man, it's a big one. I mean, for all of the ways in which we're talking about how Brazil and the United States are different, there also is just so many things that the two nations share in common as these big, diverse countries with, fraught racial histories and cosmopolitan populations, and just what happens matters so much.
Totally. Yeah. Large multiracial democracies with, violent police forces, countries that see themselves as playing a leadership role not only in the hemisphere but in the world, and it's just tragic, even aside from the pandemic, how far Brazil has fallen in diplomatic terms in its standing from the kind of assertive, positive role that it played a decade and a half ago to this real pariah status that Brazil is just not used to playing. Right, Brazil is usually looked upon favorably in international forums and all of that. And I think it's the damage that this administration has done will take a long time to repair, I think. Because it's one thing for the United States to burn bridges and, for Trump to alienate, European allies and all of that. But it's the United States, right? Brazil doesn't have that luxury, I think, of sort of expending.
We can just bully everyone into being friends with us again.
Pretty much, right? And Brazil relies on kind of cultural diplomacy and strategic investments to dig itself out of this hole. Again, I think if anybody can do that, it would be someone like Lula, who seems eager to lead that charge. But
absolutely. Yeah. Well, I think we're coming up on time here. I did want to quickly, before we jump off, give you a chance to briefly speak about the book you're working on, if you'd like to tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah. So it's based on my dissertation that I defended in 2018 at Brown. It's been consistently delayed now because I had we had some kids, and then now the coronavirus. I need to get back to the archives in Brazil. But basically, it's a history of 20th century politics in Brazil, organized around this idea of nationalism, of nationalist, what I call the nationalist label. So what does it mean to identify as a nationalist, to call something a nationalist agenda? to speak of nationalism at different points in the 20th century, what kind of appeals work, what kind of arguments work in one moment and other times don't. Because over the course of the 20th century, nationalism is invoked to justify social democratic reforms and the expansion of democracy, and then just a few years later to justify authoritarian right-wing dictatorship.
Totally.
And so it's this kind of history of the 20th century told through the shifting definitions of nationalism. And so,
that slippery word self-determination that kind of goes through the whole...
Exactly, the national interest. Like, how does that get defined? What arguments work to mobilize people, right, around a certain agenda? So
we were going to have you back on to talk about that for sure, because there's so much
to.
interesting things to talk about in terms of just use and misuse of the term nationalism. Even it almost has become a useless article, along with so many vocabulary words that we.
That's part of what drew me to the argument. Exactly, because this seems like a moment to be talking about definitions of nationalism, right? Like, what is my nationalism? What is your nationalism? What is patriotism? I mean, these
right,
kind of slippery
and sort of the
words
way that manifests in colonial nations and former colonized nations, and how different, it can have very different meanings in those
it's gonna be
different
proud of your
contexts.
Country. Yeah, but not you guys.
Exactly.
Yeah.
You guys be proud
Not
of your
you.
country.
That's why I'm eager to get the book done, so I can really have these conversations, and then people can read it and all of that. So
all right,
my goal
get off
is
our show and back to work
next year.
then, sir.
Exactly.
Well, thank you so much. Yeah, thank you, Andre. This was fantastic, and we'll look forward to. Yes, we'll be watching closely next year, and we'll be looking forward to having you back.
Sounds good. Good luck with the show. Thanks again for the invitation. It was a real pleasure. Thank you, guys.
Ciao.